Once again, I am Professor Maria Romana Daguio, your assigned online learning coordinator for this course. So this week, class, we're going to discuss about the kinds of obligation. So without further ado, we already waited for other students to join. So at this point of time, let us now start our discussion. Okay. So the first kinds class of obligation are as to sanction. Okay? So ang pinag-uusapan natin dito ay sanction. Okay. The civil or perfect obligation, it is an obligation whose sanction is law. So the basis of its sanction class is the law or the positive law. So whatever written in the law, that would be the basis. Okay? Natural obligation or naturalis obligatio is one enforceable by law, but nevertheless binding on the obligor by dictate of his conscience and the basic postulates of natural law, justice, and equity. So ito ay batay no sa magandang kalooban, konsensya class ng debtor. So we have learned this last week. All right, next is the moral obligation. So moral obligation is a duty imposed by ethical or religious belief. So this is based on the ethical standards no set by, say for example, the organization kung saan ka nakabilang, okay, napapabilang, and religious belief nung religion na kinabibilangan mo, doon magbabatay ang dapat mong gawin, dapat mong ikilos, no? And as well as the sanctions also will be based on that. So those are the three kinds of obligations class, no, as to sanction. Again, that is civil, natural, and moral obligation. Okay, let's proceed now to kinds of obligation as to subject matter. Okay, so this subject matter here, class, we are referring to the three prestations. So we have to give, to do, and not to do. Okay, so if we speak of an obligation no, to give, now we are referring to real obligation. But if we are talking about a prestation to do and not to do, we are referring now to personal obligation. Okay, so those two are the kinds of obligations as to the subject matter, real obligation and personal obligation. Next, as to the number of persons obliged. Okay, so we have unilateral obligation. From the word uniclass, obviously, no, the party, no, the number of party that is bound to perform the prestation is only one. That's why uni. So it says here that it is one where only one party is bound, only one party undertakes a performance. So more often than not, normally class, it is the debtor who is bound to perform the prestation. Okay, next is the bilateral obligation from the word by, meaning to. So is one where both parties are bound, as in the contract of sales. Our example here, class, is the contract of sales. So you have the seller and the buyer. So both of them, not just the seller or not just the buyer, no, need to conform with the prestation, but both of them. Okay, both the seller and the buyer. So that's why it is called bilateral obligation. Dapat silang dalawa ang tumalima kung ano ang nakasulat, nakasaad doon sa kanilang contract. Okay? So those two, unilateral obligation and bilateral obligation, are the kinds of obligation as to number of persons obliged. Okay, next. Okay, as to mode of performance. Okay, so paano ba natin gagawin or i-perform yung prestation? So kung ang hinihingi sa atin class ay magbigay tayo at gumawa, alimbawa, no? At ang basehan para masabi na na-fulfill natin yung obligation ay kailangan may action, we call that positive obligation. So, it is an obligation to give and to do. The essence is affirmative action. While in negative obligation, it is an obligation not to give or not to do. The essence is inaction or non-action. So, wala tayong dapat ibigay, wala rin tayong dapat gawin. So, ito ang nakalagay doon. Ito yung prestation, no, na hinihingi sa atin. So, negative obligation ang tawag doon. So, pag merong ine-expect na gagawin or ibibigay, positive. Pag walang ine-expect sa atin na gawin or ibigay, we call that negative obligation. So again, those two are the kinds of obligation as to mode of performance. How about as to sequence of performance? We have primary obligation and the secondary obligation. So in primary obligation class, the principal object, no, is what we are talking about, no? The principal object of the contract. Okay, so kung ano ang talagang pinapagawa sa'yo, mainly, yun ang primary obligation. But we also have secondary obligation. So, kailan pumapasok yung secondary obligation? So, pagka hindi nagawa, hindi na-perform, hindi kayang i-perform yung primary obligation, doon na magkakaroon ng secondary obligation. So, normally class, this is based on the will of the creditor. So, siya ang magtatakda, no, nasa kalooban niya kung ano ang secondary obligation. The debtor can suggest, no, it's up for the approval of the creditor. So that is those are the kinds rather of obligation as to sequence of performance. Ano yung una nating gagawin? Ano una yung nating ipe-perform? Next, kinds of obligation as to object. Okay, so object naman ang pinag-uusapan dito. Remember class that object is one of the essential requisites of obligation. No? Kung naaalala nyo pa, we have four. First is the active subject, the passive subject, and then this one, the object, and then lastly, the vinculum juris or the juridical tie. So, as to object, we have two, the principal obligation and accessory. Last week, we have given the car as our example. So, the car is the principal object, and then attached to that principal object is the so-called accessories. So, it is also your duty to deliver the accessory. So, you have now the accessory obligation. One, which depends upon or peripheral or also collateral to the principal. So, remember that the accessories class serves two purposes, no? Two purposes. What are those? To serve as an ornament or to render the object, no, the principal object effective or functional. So just like radio, no, or stereo, no, nasakyan. So pwedeng ornament kasi you can use naman the car even without the radio, but having a radio in a car, no, mas maganda, no? So nakakaganda siya. So ornament. Okay, how about the key? That will render the car functional. Kasi pag walang key, no, hindi natin magagamit. Okay, so maraming accessories ang car class. Pwedeng pati yung gasolina niya, no, yung ano pa, yung mga ilaw na nandun, no, etc. So maraming accessories. So again, those are the two kinds of obligation as to object, the principal and accessory. Let's move on, class, to the kinds of obligation under the civil code. Okay, so we have pure and conditional obligation, which is the main focus class of our discussion this afternoon. No, we will focus on pure and conditional obligation, but also I will give you a brief explanation of the other kinds of obligation, starting with obligation with the period. So obviously, these are kinds of obligation with certain time frame or period. So you are bound to perform the prestation, no, to comply with the obligation, no, within specific time period, time frame. We call that obligation with a period. Next is alternative obligation. So there are times, class, wherein the creditor may give you an option. No, it's either for you to give either for you to do or not to do. So it's up to you to choose. Okay, but the moment you choose, say for example, the prestation of to give, you have to fulfill that to complete that prestation class. But never, remember this, never na out of three options na yon, kalakalahati lang i-perform mo and then later on you compel the creditor to accept it as a full performance of your obligation. No, hindi po pwede. So if you choose to give, i-comply mo yung buong obligation na yun na to give, no? And forget the other options, no? You just have to choose. Kaya nga alternative. Okay? So pag hindi mo kaya yung to give, you have the option to do, no? Etc. So that is alternative obligation. But the general rule class, remember, we cannot compel the creditor. Hindi natin siya pwedeng pilitin na tanggapin yung ating kalahating ginawa o kalahati na ibibigay, no, para maging kabuuan, no, na performance ng ating obligation, no. Okay? So next, joint obligation. So from the word itself, no, sama-sama kayo, joint. Okay, for example, tatlo kayong debtors, okay? So hati-hati kayo sa performance ng obligation. So ito yung part mo, ito yung part niya, ito yung part niya. Okay? So, that is joint obligation. Lahat kayo may participation. How about solidary obligation? The creditor class can compel from any of the debtors. Ibig sabihin, pwede siyang mag-require sa isa sa inyo ng kabuuang performance. And then later on, kung sino yung gawa ng prestation, pwede na lang niya i-reimburse doon sa iba pang kasama niya na debtors. Okay, kung siya ay nagbayad buo, so yung binayad niya, yung parte ng iba, sa kanya i-reimburse. Pwede naman yun. Sunod, divisible obligation. So from the word itself, class, divisible, kayang i-divide. Okay, for example, ang obligasyon mo ay mag-renovate ng bahay. Okay, pwede ba siyang hati-hatiin? Yes. No? This week, sabihin natin, yung ano muna, yung labas muna ang i-renovate mo, no? Then sa next week, pwedeng yung sala naman, no, yung kusina, so on and so forth. So that can be divided, no? We call that obligation as divisible obligation. So the opposite of that obviously is the indivisible. Hindi kayang hati-hatiin. Ano ang halimbawa? When the BIR sets deadline class for the payment of taxes, you have to pay your full tax, no? Not payment in installment. Na sabihin mo, this week, 10% muna, 20% na sa susunod, and sa December na yung kulang, no? You have to comply. Kung magkano kailangan mo bayaran, bayaran mo in full. That is indivisible obligation. Hindi kayang hatiin. Okay? So, parang ano lang, halimbawa pa, magdi-deliver ka nung lesson natin last time class, di ba, yung object, tapos may fruit na. So, hindi po pwedeng installment. Yung nanay muna ng aso ang i-deliver ko. Saka na yung fruit na tuta. No. Kasi, maaaring merong mangyari hindi maganda kung hindi mo sabay gawin yung obligasyon. Okay? Pag iniwan mo pa yung tuta, saan yun kukuha ng gatas, no? Sa nanay dapat. So, dapat kasama yun. So, maaaring may mangyari. Kaya hindi pwede i-divide. Alright. So, last is the obligation with a penal clause. So, we have our primary obligation. May mga instances, class, na ang batas, no, o ang creditor naglalagay ng obligation with penal clause. Ano ito? Ito yung klase ng obligation na madadagdag doon sa primary obligation mo pag hindi mo natupad yung primary obligation. So, ito, hinihikayat natin dito ang debtor, no, yung nagkautang, na i-perform na lang yung obligation kasi or else, kung hindi, maaari siya magbayad ng karagdagan, no? May penalty, no? Etc. So we call that obligation with a penal clause. So those are other kinds, class, of obligation under the civil code. But let us focus our discussion with these two, pure and conditional obligation. All right. So what is pure obligation? So it says that every obligation whose performance does not depend upon a future or uncertain event or past event not known to the parties is demandable at once and is called a pure obligation. So kung wala namang kinalaman class sa nakaraan na event, nakaraan na pangyayari o sa future na magaganap, okay, future event, o kaya naman yung mga event na hindi alam ng dalawang partido, no? Makatuwid class, ang obligasyon na yon ay demandable at once. Pwede nang i-demand ni creditor ang performance ni debtor and kailangan na rin i-perform ni debtor ang prestation. Ngayon na. That is pure obligation. Another simple explanation class is, pag wala naman nakasaad na kondisyon, no, direkta namang binigay sa iyo yung obligation, we call that pure obligation. So later we will discover what is conditional obligation. Okay. Article 1179. Every obligation whose performance does not depend upon a future or uncertain event or upon a past event unknown to the parties is demandable at once. So just like I mentioned to you earlier, pag wala naman yan kinalaman, hindi nakadepende sa nakaraan, sa hinaharap na mga pangyayari, then matatawag natin na yan ay pure obligation at yan ay demandable at once. Ngayon, pwede mo nang i-demand yan, no? So every obligation which contains a resolutory condition shall also be demandable without prejudice to the effects of the happening of the event. So there are other obligations, types of obligations that has condition. So one of that is resolutory condition, na kung saan ang pagganap ng event in the future, no, ay magpapahinto sa obligasyon. So mamaya may example tayo dyan. Pag nangyari na class, yung iniintay natin na event na yun in the future, okay, demandable na rin ang obligation. So kagaya sinabi ko kanina, mahihinto. So hindi mo na pwedeng pilitin, no, si debtor na isigi pa, i-continue pa yung obligation kasi nga, no, demandable na siya. Ibig sabihin, no, si debtor ay meron ng karapatan na ihinto kasi naganap na ang condition. Okay. So mamaya meron tayong example. Okay, the Tagalog version of that class. Bawat obligasyon kung saan ang pagtupad nito ay nakadepende sa inaharap o hindi tukoy na pangyayari o mga kaganapan sa nakaraan na hindi alam ng bawat isa ay kaagad na pwedeng hingin. Sino ang pwedeng humingi? Creditor. At agad naman dapat tatalima si debtor sa pagsunod kung ano yung obligasyon. So, bawat obligasyon na may kaakibat na kondisyon kung saan sa pamamagitan ng isang pangyayari ay nawawala ng bisa ang obligasyon ay maaari ding iakyat o hingin sa korte o kaya'y ng isang partido nang walang epekto sa inaasahang pangyayari na magpapawalang bisa sa obligasyon. Okay, let's have comment on that class. Article 1179, first paragraph, speaks of pure obligation. So again, class, what is pure obligation? So it is one that is demandable at once because it does not depend upon a future or uncertain event, not on past event, unknown to the parties, and it's not an obligation with a resolutory condition. Okay. A simple promissory note to pay certain amount without certain period, no, within rather a certain period is an example of pure obligation. So let's have an example class. I promise to pay Mr. Navarro the amount of 10,000 pesos on November 18, 2019. So obviously, wala pong nakastipulate dito na any condition. So we can simply say that easily say that this obligation is pure. Okay? Siya lang ay nangako kay Mr. Navarro na magbabayad ng 10,000 sa November 18, 2019. Halimbawa naman, sinabi niya, I promise to pay Mr. Navarro the amount of 10,000 pesos on November 18 if I already received my company bonus. So meron na agad condition. So we cannot categorize that class as pure obligation. Saan na siya magpo-fall? Dito na ngayon sa sumunod, conditional obligation. So, what is conditional obligation? Is one, the fulfillment of which is a subject to a certain condition, which may be an event which may or may not happen. Nakadepende siya class sa isang event na pwede or hindi mangyayari. It could be suspensive or resolutory. So dalawa ang klase ng condition class under conditional obligation, suspensive and resolutory. So let us discuss that one by one. A suspensive condition is a future or uncertain event, the happening of which give birth to the obligation. So meron tayong iniintay na future event, no? Pag nangyari 'yon, saka lang po magkakaroon ng obligation. Bigyan natin ng halimbawa. Andre Navarro promises to give Miss Daguio a condo unit if she passed the bar exam. Who are the parties involved? Andre Navarro and Miss Daguio. What is the object? The condo unit. Ano ang condition? To pass the bar exam. So pag nangyari yung event na yon, class, no? Yung suspensive condition na yon, saka lang magkakaroon ng obligation si Andre Navarro to give the condo unit to Miss Daguio. So the obligation cannot be demanded at once. Hindi pa yung pwedeng hingin ni Miss Daguio kay Andre, no? But becomes demandable only upon Miss Daguio passing the bar. So, kailan magiging demandable, class? Pag nangyari na yung condition, okay? Pagpasa sa bar. Sabi natin kanina, may or may not happen. What if hindi nangyari na pumasa si Miss Daguio sa bar? Then, that extinguished, no, the obligation of Andre Navarro. Wala na siyang obligation kasi hindi naman natupad yung condition. Okay. So, again, a suspensive condition from the word suspensive, class. Nasususpend muna. Kumbaga, status quo muna tayo. Okay? Mangyayari lang yan pag natupad yung condition. How about resolutory condition? So actually, class, this is the exact opposite of the suspensive. No? Resolutory condition is an event, the passing of which, no, extinguishes the obligation. Pag nangyari yon, nawawala ang obligation. Samantala yung suspensive, pag nangyari yon, saka pa lang magkakaroon ng obligation. So, bigyan natin ng halimbawa. A promises to pension B in the amount of 5,000 per month until such time that she gets married. Who are the parties involved? A and B. Okay, what is the object? Yung pension. Okay? And ano ang condition? Gets married. Hanggat hindi pa kinakasal. Okay? Nag-promise si A na magbibigay ng buwan ng sustento kay B hanggat hindi pa ito kinakasal. The obligation to give monthly pension starts immediately. So the moment na nangako si A na magbibigay, nagsimula na agad yun. Okay? But the moment B is married, the obligation stops. So you see, resolutory class, pag nangyari na yung event, hihinto na yung obligation. Marriage is the resolutory condition as it extinguishes the obligation. So ngayon, class, kanina, I don't know kung naaalala nyo, sabi ko, pag nangyari yung event, hindi pwedeng pilitin, no, si debtor na gawin pa rin yung pinangako niya kasi tapos na, natupad na yung condition. So, hindi pwedeng pilitin ni B na sige pa rin, no, magbigay pa rin sa kanya si A ng 5,000 per month kasi nga, natupad naman na yung condition. So, yung pangyayari, yung pagtupad sa condition na yon, yung pagganap, no, ng event na yon ay nagpawala na doon sa obligation. So, that is suspensive and resolutory condition, no, the types of conditional obligation. Okay. Article 1180. When the debtor binds himself to pay when his means permit him to do so, the obligation shall be deemed to be one with a period, subject to the provisions of Article 1197. So kung nangako class si debtor, yung nagkautang na magbabayad siya, ito ay pangako na dapat may period. May eksaktong date kung kailan siya magbabayad. Hindi po pwedeng open. Kung ang nangutang ay nangako sa kanyang sarili na bayaran ang kanyang utang kapag ang kanyang pamamaraan o kakayanan ay pinahihintulutan na gawin ito, ang pananagutan ay itinuturing bilang isa na may nakatakdang panahon. Dapat may nakatakdang panahon na naaayon sa probisyon ng Artikulo 1197. Ano ba yung Artikulo 1197? Sinasabi lang dito, class, na for instances na walang specific period na nakasaad kung kailan magbabayad, korte dapat ang magtakda kung kailan yung period na yon, kailan yung fixed term na yon. Okay? Yun ang sinasabi. But never na nakadepende sa kalooban ni debtor. Kung kailan lang siya may means, may resources, magbayad sa'yo, saka lang siya magbabayad. No. We will also protect the rights of the creditor. Hindi pwede. Okay? So, kailangan may specific period para fair. To give ample time for the debtor to collect or to have the payment kung yan ay utang. And also, bigyan din natin ng karapatan si creditor na mag-expect din naman ng payment dun sa pera na kanyang pinautang. So, yun ang sinasabi sa Article 1180. So, here are some of the example of phrases plus na kadalasan natin naririnig sa mga may mga utang sa atin. Nasabi dyan, when my means permit to do so. Pag meron na ako, bayaran kita. When I am able to. Pag kaya ko na magbayad, magbabayad ako. When I have money. Pag may pera na ako, saan kita bayaran? So parang kung ikaw yung creditor, parang kawawa ka naman, no? So leaving the discretion to either of the creditor or debtor would be unjust. So hindi makatarungan plus na papaubaya natin ang kagustuhang magbayad kay debtor at ang kagustuhang maningil lang kay creditor. So para pareho maprotektahan ang kanilang rights, no? Therefore, Article 1197 should be applied where the court is obliged to fix the duration of the period. So, si court ang magtatakda. So, the general rule, the creditor must ask the court first for the fixing of the term. And it is only when the term set arrives that he can demand fulfillment. So, pag na-set na class ni court ang term, dumating na yung araw na yon, halimbawa, doon lang pwede mag-demand si creditor ng payment, no, or performance ng prestation kay debtor. At doon din sa araw na yon, no, obligado yung duty ni debtor na i-perform yung performance. Doon sisimula sa araw na yon. Okay? So that is Article 1197. Okay, Article 1181. If in conditional obligations rather, the acquisition of rights as well as the extinguishment or loss of those already acquired shall depend upon the happening of the event which constitutes the condition. So sa mga pagkakataon class na ang klase ng obligation ay conditional obligations, ibig sabihin may mga naka-attach na conditions, okay? Lahat ng na-acquire mo na rights, pati yung pagpapawalang bisa sa mga rights na yon, pagkawala ng rights na yon, ay nakabatay, nakadepende kung mangyayari o hindi yung hinihintay natin na condition. Sa Tagalog, minsan kasi class mas madali pang maintindihan, no? Sa totoo lang, yung English kaysa sa Tagalog. Sa kondisyong obligasyon, ang pagkuha ng mga karapatan, pati na ang pagpatay o pagkawala ng mga natamo ay dapat na depende sa nangyayari sa kaganapan na bumubuo sa kondisyon. I told you, minsan tricky pa yung Tagalog. Pero yun na, lahat ng rights na na-acquire mo na, no? Pwede rin itong mawala sa'yo, no? Kung mangyayari ba o hindi, yung iniintay natin na event. Okay. So, again, let's review. Conditional obligation is that kind of obligation which subject to condition either suspensive or resolutory. So, for you to better understand the suspensive, let's have another example. Okay. I promise to give Adriel 15,000 if he passes the school entrance exam. Okay. Who are the parties involved? I and Adriel. Okay? What is the object? The 15,000. What is the suspensive condition? Passing the school entrance exam. The obligation cannot be demandable, no? At once, cannot be demanded, but becomes demandable only upon Adriel's passing the school entrance exam. So, hindi po pwede class na i-demanda niya sa akin, Adriel, yung 15,000 ngayon na. Kasi hindi pa naman nangyayari yung event. No? Kung makapasa siya, then I am obliged to give the 15,000. No? But kung naganap na yung event at hindi naman na-satisfy yung condition, then extinguish na ako sa obligation kasi hindi naman niya natupad yung pagpasa, no, doon sa school entrance exam. So that is another example class of suspensive condition. How about resolutory condition? Okay, example. I promise to support Anne 2,000 per month until such time that she already got a job. The obligation to give a monthly pension starts immediately, but the moment Anne got a job, the obligation stops. So sa ngayon, dahil wala pang trabaho si Anne, sige, susuportahan ko siya 2,000. Pero matitigil yung pension na yon, yung support na yon, no? Pag nagkatrabaho na siya. So ano ang hinihintay nating mangyari? Magkatrabaho si Anne. So yun ang resolutory condition. Pag naganap na yon, okay, matitigil na yung aking pagbibigay ng pera monthly. Okay, let's move on. Article 1182. When the fulfillment of the condition depends upon the sole will of the debtor, the conditional obligation shall be void. So kung ang pagtalima, pagtupad doon sa nakasaad na kondisyon ay nakabatay lamang sa kalooban, no, ng debtor, sa solong kalooban niya, ibig sabihin nakadepende lang sa kanya kung gagawin ba niya or hindi. So masasabi natin na yung conditional obligation na yun ay hindi valid. Void yun, class. Walang bisa. If it depends upon a chance or upon the will of a third person, the obligation shall take effect in conformity with the provisions of this code. What if sa ang condition class, pagtupad sa condition ay nakasalalay naman sa third person? So maaari nating ituring na ito ay may bisa. Okay? Only kung nag-conform, sumunod siya kung ano yung sinasaad dito sa code na ito. Okay, basahin natin yung Tagalog. Kung ang pagganap ng isang kondisyon ay nakadepende lamang sa may pagkakautang, ang kondisyonal na obligasyon ay walang bisa. Kung ito naman ay nakasalalay sa pagkakataon o di kaya sa kalooban ng ikatlong persona, ang obligasyon ay magkakabisa ng naaayon sa probisyon ng pamantayang ito. Okay. So, kinds of conditions. Ito class, ito yung mga klase ng conditions kung saan nanggaling yung kalooban. Ito ba ay, ang nakadepende ba ay kalooban ni debtor or ni creditor, ni third person, etc. So, una, potestative, one which depends upon the will of one of the contracting parties. So, galing ang will sa isa sa contracting parties, po pwedeng kay debtor, po pwedeng kay creditor, kay A or kay B. Casual naman if it is from third person. Mixed naman, mixed condition naman class, pagka combination ng potestative and casual. So example, I will give you a house if you marry Princess. Okay, so Princess here class is the third person. Pero sino talaga ang contracting parties? I and kung sino man yung kausap ko, for example, si Juan de la Cruz, no? I will give you Juan de la Cruz a house if you marry Princess. So, si Princess ang third person kasi hindi naman siya originally yung nasa contract, no? Siya lang yung kailangan natin, no? Para mabuo yung, maisagawa rather yung condition. So, that is kinds, no? Of conditions, potestative, casual, and mixed condition. Article 1183. Impossible conditions, those contrary to good customs or public policy, and those prohibited by law shall annul the obligation which depends upon them. So yung mga nakalagay na condition na itinuturing na imposible dahil ito ay labag sa batas, labag sa magandang kaugalian, public policy, etc. So kung ano man yung kaakibat na obligasyon ng kondisyon na yon ay ipapaanal, ipapawalang bisa. Okay? If the obligation is divisible, excuse me, kung nahahati daw, kayang hatiin ang obligasyon, that part thereof which is not affected by the impossible or unlawful condition shall be valid. Kung ano mang parte doon, ang hindi naman or wala namang nilalabag na batas or nilalabag na kagandahang asal or whatsoever, pwede pa rin yun maging valid. Okay? Ito yung sa mga pagkakataon na ang pinag-uusapan natin ay divisible obligation. So the condition not to do an impossible thing shall be considered as not having been agreed upon. So kung ang kondisyon na meron tayo ay mga impossible conditions, as if walang nangyaring agreement between us. Hindi yun ituturing na valid. Article 1184, no? Bago ako pumunta dito, class, I don't know kung maaalala niyo yung sinabi natin na though contract, no, has the force of law, no? Sabi doon, 'di ba, isa sa sources, class, ng obligation ng contract. Sabi doon, kung naalala niyo, though contract has the force of law, but never that contract can go beyond or above the law. Ano ang ibig lang sabihin nun? Pwede siya maglagay ng stipulations, ng mga conditions doon, phrases, clauses, no, terms, for as long as it is not contrary to law. So yun exactly yung sinabi natin kanina na pag impossible conditions yan as if walang agreement na nangyari. Kasi contrary yun. So Article 1184, the condition that some event happen at a determinate time shall extinguish the obligation as soon as the time expires, or if it has become indubitable that the event will not take place. So may mga conditions, class, na meron tayong iniintay na certain period. Okay, so pag dumating na yung certain period na yun at hindi naman na-comply ang condition, yung may pananagutan, mawawalan na siya ng pananagutan. Kasi lumagpas na tayo sa period. O kaya naman, hindi pa tayo lumalagpas sa period, pero yung condition na iniintay natin, walang duda, indubitable, walang duda na hindi na siya mangyayari. Ngayon, kailangan ng i-extinguish yung obligation. So, in Tagalog, ang kondisyon na mangyayari ang ilang kaganapan sa isang nakatakdang panahon ay dapat magpawalang bisa sa obligasyon mula sa sandaling ang panahong ito ay lumipas o sa sandaling maging walang dudang ang kaganapang ito ay hindi mangyayari. Okay, bigyan natin ng hustisya yung artikulo na yan. Okay, example. Andrada obliged himself to give Bautista 100,000. But with a condition, of course, and that is for Bautista to marry Cruz before he turns 23. Parties involved, Andrada and Bautista. Ang third party natin dito, class, si Cruz. Okay? So, if Bautista marries Cruz before he reaches 23, Andrada is liable. So, kung magpapakasal, class, si Bautista at si Cruz bago pa mag-23 si Bautista, obligado si Andrada na ibigay yung pinangako niya na 100,000. If Bautista marries Cruz when he turns 23 or after, Andrada is not liable because time has expired without the condition being fulfilled. So kung nagpakasal nga si Bautista at Cruz pero hindi naman natupad yung kondisyon na bago mag-23, kinasal sila, 23 eksakto si Bautista o lumagpas pa, no, 24, 25, no, whatever, hindi na liable, class, si Andrada. Yung obligasyon ni Andrada na magbigay ng 100 ay na-extinguish na, nawala na. Dahil lumagpas na tayo doon sa period, hindi mo pa na fulfill yung condition. Obligation ceases as soon as Bautista turns 23. Okay? So yung obligasyon ni Andrada na magbigay ng pera ay mawawala, no, as soon as, ibig sabihin, pag tumuntong na ng 23 si Bautista. Okay? If Bautista dies at age of 22 without marrying Cruz, it is indubitable that the event will not take place. So walang duda na hindi na talaga mangyayari yung iniintay natin na marriage. So, obligation ceases although the time has not expired. Nawala na yung obligation kahit pa nga, no, yung panahon ay hindi pa na nararating, no? Not expired, hindi pa expired. So 22 pa lang si Bautista, namatay na siya. So ano pang i-fulfill na obligation ni Andrada? Wala na. Kasi wala na yung kanyang kausap, no? So that is an example for that class. Article 1185, The condition that some event will not happen at a determined time shall render the obligation effective from the moment the time indicated has elapsed or it has become evident that the event cannot occur. If no time has been fixed, the condition shall be deemed fulfilled at such time as may have probably been contemplated, bearing in mind the nature of the obligation. Ang kondisyon na hindi mangyayari ang ilang kaganapan sa isang nakatakdang panahon ay magdudulot upang ang obligasyon ay maging epektibo mula sa sandali ang panahong ipinahihiwatig ay lumipas o kung naging maliwanag na ang kaganapan ay hindi mangyayari. Sakaling walang panahong itinakda, ang kondisyon ay dapat ituring na natupad na sa panahong maaaring napagnilayan na isinaalang-alang ang katangian ng obligasyon. Okay, let's move on. Obligations dependent on negative condition. So, non-occurrence of a future event, non-performance of an act. So, kailan yung mga instances na merong negative condition, class? First, time has elapsed and the event indicated not to happen, did not happen. So, yung mga sinabi natin na hindi mangyayari, hindi nga talaga nangyari. It is evident, makikita, obvious, that the event that should not happen, na hindi nga mangyayari, ay talaga namang, no, cannot really happen. Example, Aquino obliged himself to deliver a parcel of land to Garcia. Nangako si Aquino na magbibigay kay Garcia ng lupa. Kung, ito ang condition, Garcia will not or shall not run for mayor in their municipality within 6 years. Okay? If more than 6 years has elapsed without Garcia running for mayor, Aquino's obligation becomes effective. So kung hindi nga naman tumakbo si Garcia bilang mayor ng kanilang municipality sa loob ng 6 na taon, no, obligado si Aquino class na magbigay ng lupa. Kasi nasunod naman 'di ba? Na-fulfill naman yung condition. The municipality disappeared before 6 years. Nawala yung municipality for whatever reason, no? Nawala, no? Before 6 years has elapsed, Aquino's obligation becomes effective. Ano yung obligasyon niya? Magbigay ng lupa. Because it is evident that Garcia cannot now run for mayor in that municipality. So, kung nawala yung municipality, hindi po pwedeng sabihin ni Aquino na, ay wala na rin akong obligasyon sa iyo. No. Obvious kasi na matutupad talaga. Walang duda na matutupad ni Garcia yung condition kasi hindi na talaga siya makakatakbo kasi nag-disappear nga yung municipality. Alright? So, that is another example. Next. Article 1186. The condition shall be deemed fulfilled when the obligor voluntarily prevents its fulfillment. Again, the condition shall be deemed fulfilled when the obligor voluntarily prevents its fulfillment. Okay? Ang kondisyon ay dapat ituring na natupad na kapag ang obligasyon mismo, ang may obligasyon mismo ang voluntaryong pumigil sa pagtupad nito. So, ituturing natin na natupad na yung condition kung yung mismo may obligasyon, yung may utang, ang pumigil para tupadin yun. Mamaya may example tayo. So, what are the principles behind that? Parties must perform their obligations in good faith. No person shall profit his own wrong. Walang sino man tao ang magbebenepisyo, makikinabang sa ginawa niyang mali. Okay? Wala dapat. A person to a contract may not be excused from performing his promise by non-occurrence of an event which he himself prevented. So, walang sino man ang magiging excuse sa pagtuloy ng kanyang pinangako kung siya mismo, no, ang gumawa ng paraan para hindi mangyari yung condition na yon. Ito ang halimbawa natin. Merong tao na umutang halimbawa sa akin. Okay, sabi ko sa kanya, okay, Juan de la Cruz, hindi kita sisingilin. Okay, hindi kita sisingilin kung hindi naman uuwi yung anak ko. Okay, halimbawa, galing abroad. Okay, so hindi kita sisingilin kung halimbawa hindi naman siya umuwi kasi hindi naman din namin kakailanganin ng pera, halimbawa, no, kung hindi siya uuwi. So ikaw, gagawin mo lahat ng paraan para wag umuwi, no, yung tao na yon. So, nangyari yung bagay na yon, yung hindi pag-uwi, hindi dahil natural, no, na circumstances, kundi meron kang ginawa. You prevented, no, yung pag-uwi na yon. So, kung ano man yung naiisip nyo na dahilan na pwedeng gawin, ginawa niya. Okay? So, ngayon class, hindi pa rin siya excuse doon sa kanyang promise, no? Dapat na singilin ko siya. Okay? So kung magkagayon na nalaman ko na siya mismo ang gumawa ng paraan para ma-prevent yung anak ko na umuwi, okay, then the obligation is now demandable. Okay, so that is Article 1186. So class, that ends our lesson for this afternoon. We will continue other articles class. Okay, so with that, thank you and God bless everyone. Bye.